Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another session of the Rising Tide Foundation. And today's lecture or class, presentation, whatever you want to call it, is going to be by our good friend, David Gosselin. And the title of his presentation is Escaping Huxley's Island. Now, for some of us, Aldous Huxley, we know his novel, The Brave New World, but apparently his last novel was called The Island. I didn't know that, but so that's a nice punny title, Escaping Huxley's Island. Psychedelics, Scientific Paganism, and the Changing Images of Man. And psychedelics, it makes me think of, the MK Ultra project. And well, today there's this whole push on to legalize every kind of drug and psychedelics, narcotics there is. And the scientific paganism, that reminds me of the transhumanism, where they say they're trying to get computers to think like humans, but I think it's the opposite. They're trying to get humans to think like computers. Psychedelic, scientific paganism, and the changing images of man. I like that because that's sort of the center of everything. Our image of man. What is our conception of humanity? Because that really determines a lot of everything else. And I think it should be a good class. So without further ado, here is our classical poet and essayist, David Gosselin.
Thank you, Jerry. You can hear me all right? Hi,
yes,
everybody.
Hear you fine, see you fine.
So I'm just looking here at my screen. I can see Jerry and myself. Can't see everyone else, but so yes, I have a new paper coming out. It hasn't come out yet. So, but anybody who's if you're subscribed to my Substack, Age of Muses, once the article drops, you'll know about it. So yeah, psychedelic, scientific paganism, and the changing images of man. Just by a show of, can I see the hands? Yeah. How many people have heard of Huxley's novel, The Island? We all know Brave New World, and these days everybody's like, we're in a Brave New World. But actually, when we read something like Huxley's Island, which is a pretty fascinating book, we're going to read passages. So this presentation's kind of going to be a companion piece to the actual article, because the article will have its own thing. So yeah, each one will complement. I'll talk about things that aren't in the article, and hopefully we'll have a nice discussion. So definitely, we may fall down some spiritual rabbit holes and do some off-road journeying, hopefully. But yeah, as far as The Island, have most people heard about it, or?
Does the movie count?
There is a movie about that, isn't there, huh?
Yeah, with Ewan McGregor.
Okay. No, I haven't seen the movie. I read the book, at least. That's a nice change. Usually
probably better.
I say the opposite, right? I've seen the Lord of the Rings movie, but the books, that's who's got time for that, right? But no, we should read the books. So yeah, we're gonna read from The Island, and I guess everybody's got the invitation, so they've read the intro. The intro is directly from my article. And I mean, there's many ways that we could go about this. One of the main works that I used for this presentation is something called The Changing Images of Man, which is a Stanford Research Institute white paper from the 1970s, which is really one of the more deeply entrenched and advanced, you could say, Luciferian brain trusts, where all like the very clever and sophisticated ideas are coming from, in terms of reframing our civilization, right? Everybody seems to notice, things seem to be changing so fast. And, many people are asking questions and we have trouble sort of putting a name on it, right? And we all have, we see different things happening, and then we all try and interpret, symbol for this, symbol for that. But where's the stuff really coming from? And, how do we overcome it? But and I'm thinking out loud here because there are a few paradoxes. I was having a conversation with somebody, and we're talking about how a lot of these transhumanist ideals, you could say, this new age spirituality stuff, right? We've all run into it. I think we've all run into, whether it's the positive vibes, whether it's the transcending oneself, which means so many different things to different people. We've all run into this stuff, and it's, the environmentalism stuff has a lot of the new age quality and balance and energy, all these things, right? We've heard that energy can explain everything. And it can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people. But I was having a conversation, and the conclusion or the question that I asked the guy was, if a lot of these ideas are so crazy or silly, then how come the bad guys seem to be winning, right? Why do they seem to be able to change the belief structures of so many people so quickly, right? If we go into a university now, I've spoken to people who work in universities, and a lot of them, their mouths are agape. They're kind of scratching their heads like, how did this happen? How did these transformations occur so quickly? And, people come up with different explanations. But again, so I think the question here is, how are the bad guys, if we will to do a bit of shorthand, why does it seem like they're winning, right? What is it if we have such good ideas, or if the good guys in Western civilization are really on the ball, the people in the classical tradition, the tradition of classical education, the Judeo-Christian tradition, why do they all seem to be getting hammered, and all their institutions seem to be getting taken over? I think it's a fair question. So now we're going to look at some of that. And I would say the main thesis for now to entertain is that the thing is, some of the bad guys in these Luciferian brain trusts within the upper echelons of things like the, UCLA, Stanford Research Institute, all these trusts that are churning out the ideas, the white papers, the blueprints, they understand something about Western man, the average well-meaning person, and their history and their deeper sense of identity that Western man himself, I would argue, doesn't fully understand. And so that's what we're going to explore at today, that the bad guys know something that the average well-meaning person doesn't. And so they're able to come up with very sophisticated methods, because they know what they're targeting, of trying to reframe the images of man, right? The document that we're going to look at is called The Changing Images of Man. How do people experience radical transformations in their sense of identity? From rituals, if we look at cults throughout history, the Dionysian cults, voodoo cults, all these things, right? People get possessed, or the fundamentalist preachers, people, whether they're possessed by demons or whether they're terrified by hellfire, there's all sorts of different rituals where people will experience radical transformations. So all this stuff has been studied. So do we even know how our ideas and beliefs and identity are formed, how they're changed? This is what the bad guys have been looking at. So I'm going to start with a quote that's going to kind of lay the groundwork here. So this is from the Changing Images of Man document. I'm just going to read from my piece here to set up the quote. Led by futurist Willis Harman, the Changing Images of Man team presents a new vision for Western civilization, which shifts the emphasis from a so-called age of abundance to an age of new scarcity. We'll talk about what that means shortly. So the document writes, An ecological ethic is necessary if man is to avoid destroying the complex life support system on which our continued existence on the planet depends. It must recognize that available resources, including space, are limited, and must portray the human as an integral part of the natural world. It must reflect the new scarcity in an ethic of fragility, of doing more with less. It must involve not only a sense of mutual self-interest between individuals, but also the interests of fellow men and the more extensive interests among fellow creatures, both near and far, both present and future. An ecological ethic would imply movement towards a homeostatic, yet dynamic, economic and ecological system, in which the human acts in partnership with nature to harmonize ecological relationships and in establishing satisfactory recycling mechanisms. Such an ethic is necessary to achieve a synergism of heterogeneous individual and organizational micro-decisions, such that the resultant macro decisions are satisfactory to those who make the component decisions and to society. Just one more quote. Sounds pretty kind of jargony, academic, and okay, sure, we gotta have more of a, be more aware of the environment, and okay. So just introducing this quote, according to the SRI team, at the heart of Western civilization's problems lay a so-called rationalist man, which they astutely observe came to full fruition with the advent of the Golden Renaissance, of the European Golden Renaissance. So here's where they identify the crux of the problem. If we're to change, to repattern Western civilization and create a new identity for Western man, they write, in contrast to the Greek notion of man, pre-classical Greek, pagan Greek, the Judeo-Christian view holds that man is essentially separate from the rightful master over nature. This view inspired a sharp rate of increase in technological advances in Western Europe throughout the medieval period. On the other hand, the severe limitations of scholastic methodology and the restrictive views of the church prevented the formulation of an adequate scientific paradigm. It was not until the Renaissance brought a new climate of individualism and free inquiry that the necessary conditions for a new paradigm were provided. Interestingly, the Renaissance scholars turned to the Greeks to rediscover the empirical method. The Greeks possessed an objective science of things out there, which D. Campbell terms the epistemology of the other. This was the basic notion that nature was governed by laws and principles which could be discovered, and it was this that the Renaissance scholars then developed into science as we have come to know it. Just a little later on, they write, from the warp and woof of new and revived ideas fostered during the Renaissance and Reformation came notions of man as the individualist, the empiricist, and the rationalist. These notions gained irresistible power with the discoveries of Copernicus and Galileo and brought about an essentially new image of man and his role in the universe. So what's interesting here, I mean, for anybody who's been in RTF lectures, right, the question of the Renaissance image of man, this has come up. Now here the bad guys, you know, there's a lot of talk these days, you know, what went wrong? You know, how come the bad guys have been as successful as they are, you know, and we have a lot of cartoonish ideas of like, you know, people with plastic devil horns and like, they're just, you know, they're converting everybody. And there's a lot of panic and sort of Hollywood rah-rah around that. But here, the people in the SRI document are zeroing in on, it's not just even the Christian idea as such. And I think this is what we want to explore a bit. There was a development from early Christianity up until the Renaissance. You know, there's a lot of today, we just need to go back, that there was some pure truth, some pure time where the truth was in its purest and most distilled form. And we just have to sort of go back to wherever that was. And then you get people debating about where that was. But what's here, the bad guys are saying, well, the problem is really the Renaissance, right? Because it wasn't just it wasn't just doctrine, right? It wasn't just even a moral question, right? There was a change in our man's understanding of the relationship that man had with the rest of the universe. And just based on that requires a certain, how do we say, you can't just rely on doctrine, right? If you're really going to investigate the universe. But we do have Nicholas of Cusa makes the point. I think that this is what we're going to try and unpack. He makes the point that faith develops. Nicholas of Cusa being one of the great Renaissance minds, theologian, mathematician, diplomat. And he makes the point that he's a Christian. So he's saying is the basic doctrines of Christianity are rooted in timeless truth, right? Unchanging eternal truths. Then that means that these truths are by their nature infinite and can always be further developed and elaborated. So the truth, in a sense, that can come from these things has no limit. And so how do we develop these seeds? And Leibniz has a similar idea when they talk about seminas, when he talks about seminas veritas, so the seeds of truth, right? So some people will say, more orthodox minded, that the real thing, the perfect thing, the absolute pure thing is somewhere in the past. Some will say it's somewhere in the future, right? Depending on where you're coming from. But when you look at somebody like Cusa, who was one of the real Renaissance minds, or Leibniz, which was another one of the great European minds, who's responsible for a lot of what we know as modern industrial civilization in terms of the outlook and the science and developing the institutions that would do that work. They have an idea of development. So truth, perfection is not just some static thing, let's say in the past or in the future. It develops. There's always a development. And so we see that with the Renaissance image of man, the basic idea of man in the image of God, right? That every human being has a divine spark, which is, this is the foundation of Christianity. It's there from the start, is developed though also not just, I'd say, on a doctrinal level, but the idea that if we're each in the image of God, then we have the ability to discover the universe that God created, the natural laws of the universe. If we're in that image, what is it that makes us in that image? And you get a whole debate, right? Depending on where you're leaning, more orthodox, more this, more that. If man is in the image of God, then should he not be able to do godly things? Does he have not a tapax day, right? A capacity, a godlike capacity. Now, some people will freak out and they'll be like, well, that's transhumanism, right? That's the more orthodox leaning mind will right away be like, well, that's the Luciferian stuff. And that's what gets interesting when we're going to go, as we go into this document, you have these nuances. So I think the key though here, a lot of people complain that the West is, there's radical individualism, and individualism has, corrupted the minds of everybody, and and everybody just really needs to fall in line and just follow the rules again. And if we all do that, everything's going to work out fine. But the bad guys here don't even, right? They have a problem with a specific turning point in history and the image of man that resulted during that time, which was, one could argue, if we're looking at this, the history of Christianity, it was that fruition, the full fruition of this idea of man in the image of God that was something embodied, right? So divinity was also not something that people should just worship at a distance, right? If Christ was the Word made flesh, the Logos made flesh, and the idea was that he was both perfectly man and perfectly God, and that men and women should be imitating the real thing, right? The Word made flesh. That's a very practical thing. It's not just some doctrinal, right? I think we all sometimes run into this where people like to talk about the spiritual questions, which are important, right, which are key. We could argue that everything is spiritual warfare to a certain degree. A lot of the stuff that's talked about at these lectures, anyways, we could say really falls under that category. But yeah, if we just think of divinity as something in the distance, right, that we worship at a comfortable distance, which is how when we listen to theologians or different people talking about, citing the letter, not necessarily the spirit, we'll run into that. So we're in a fallen world, everybody's wicked and is an animal, but yet, God loves us and God is something sort of out there. So the Renaissance idea is quite, and if we look at the art, it's very embodied, right? Compared to what preceded it with the static Byzantine icons where divinity is this perfect, untouchable thing, unapproachable, unchanging. The Renaissance, it's very much more, you see living forms, human forms. So that's something. And what they're looking at is how this translates with science. So just with that said, the title of this paper that we're looking at is called The Changing Images of Man. So I think it would be useful to just look at a few images and let's just compare. So I'll let Susan bring that up. And ideally, people can, people are allowed to chime in if they have any reactions at this point. So I'm staring at my screen here. Everybody can see those images?
They're a little small for the phone, but that's my problem. It's all right.
Yeah, that's okay. You can technically, I open them I'm on the phone too, so I just went like that. So at the top, at my top left as well, or let's start with actually top or right side. Right side, we got Adam and Eve. So we're looking at creation myths, foundational myths. Because why should we do this? Why should we take the time to do this? The bad guys are looking at, so how do we change this deeply entrenched idea, this Judeo-Christian idea of man is in the image of God, right? That there is this spark, there is a soul, there's an ability to make discoveries and master the laws of the universe. How do you put that genie back in the bottle in order to have a more quote unquote sustainable and ecological ethic that is more amenable, to Gaia, to Mother Earth? How do we do that? So here they say, we're going to cite the changing images of man, but to complement that, let's hear from the Pope himself. So Matthew Eretz mentioned this did a great article on Pope Francis and the greening of Christianity. So he cites Pope Francis's encyclical, where Laudato Si, where Francis writes, an inadequate presentation of Christian anthropology gave rise to a wrong understanding of the relationship between human beings and the world. Often, what was handed on was a Promethean vision of mastery over the world. So that's coming from the Pope himself, the current head of the Catholic Church. So it says this Promethean image is often what was presented when considering Christian anthropological implication. So what do the bad guys say? What are the bad guys going to do? And I guess that's what we want to have fun with. We're bad guys. We want to think like bad guys. And arguably that's one of the problems. If good guys are or we'll say good guys, we're entertaining, we're having fun here. If good guys want to beat the bad guys, they should probably be able to think like the bad guys. And here in this Changing Images of Man document, which is like, I think it's close to 200 pages, it's systematically how do we put this genie back in the bottle? And they're not ideological in a sense that they're willing to look at everything: psychology, spirituality, science, economics, politics, sociology, and they're saying, let's create a whole new thing. How do we reframe all this? How do we get in there? So here's one of the fundamental one of the fundamental questions that they need to overcome if they're going to achieve their goal. No aspect of a person's total belief and value system is so unyielding to change as his basic sense of identity, his self-image. It is a well-known phenomenon in psychotherapy that the client will resist and evade the very knowledge he most needs to resolve his problems. A similar situation probably exists in society, and there is suggestive evidence both in anthropology and in history that a society tends to hide from itself knowledge which is deeply threatening to the status quo, but may in fact be badly needed for resolution of the society's most fundamental problems. The reason contemporary societal problems appear so perplexing may well be not so much their essential abstruseness and complexity as the collective resistance to perceiving the problems in a different way. So, then they go on. So this is a profound point. I think we can all entertain that. I mean, this is insightful even for ourselves. When I read that, I pondered. It gives us plenty to ponder. Our basic self-image. You know, if we're looking at a lot of the bad guys, a lot of the stuff on how to change, how to transform, how people experience transformations, it comes from studying things like family therapy, group therapy, right? When you study people with addiction problems, right? What is one of the chief obstacles to somebody who knows they have to stop their habit, which is totally destroying their lives. It's ruining their lives. They know it. They don't lack knowledge of that. But yet they're resistant to doing the kind of things that would lead to a fundamental change, because at the end of the day, their sense of identity is stuck as that. They can't really imagine their life as something other than that, right? Not really, not viscerally. So that image, or even if they can, that deep-rooted basic self-image will always just sabotage, right, the promise of any sort of genuine change. And I mean, this is a pretty general idea, right? Everybody faces that we all face that challenge in some way, basic self-image. You know, who wouldn't want to improve? And for some reason, their basic self-image seems to say, that won't work out, or yeah, that's not good, or, you know, actually those people who think that are shitty for XYZ reason. You don't really want to do that. You know, they have XYZ problem. So the image will just sort of come in one way or another. So no aspect of a person's total belief and value system is so unyielding to change as his basic sense of identity, his self-image. How do we change that? We're bad guys. How are we going to get people to reimagine or redefine how they think about themselves? It's not obvious, which is why it's a fair question. Good or for bad, right? People who they do things that are against their values, right? We've all done things that we're not proud of, or things that we're like, I wish I would have done that different. But yet something, our self-image, something just keeps us going back to that familiar thing, whatever our familiar setting or system is. So here they write, the desirability of this characteristic of the new image is based on the view that the proper end of all individual experience is the evolutionary and harmonious development of the emergent self, both as a person and as a part of wide collectives, and that the appropriate function of social institutions is to create an environment which will foster that process. This is the ethic which must supersede the man over nature ethic and the material growth and consumption ethic. which have given rise to a large portion of man's problems, as he became increasingly preoccupied with solely material aspects of exploiting and controlling nature for selfish ends, and a fragile and finite planet where the pursuit of such goals can be suicidal. So the emergent self, the experience is based on the view that the proper end of all individual experience is the evolutionary and harmonious development of the emergent self as both a person and part of wide collectives. And then they go on to say, the new paradigm, so now they're listing, hey, we've gone through the Judeo-Christian, or let's look at the images now, sorry. So the one on the right is Adam and Eve by Rembrandt. First man, first woman. And I think it's actually a pretty interesting treatment because we often get, right, I'm sure we've all seen different images of Adam and Eve. Everything is pure and happy and it's all just perfect, right? And I was also in a conversation I was having with somebody, we were talking about, we were going back to this question, if the bad guys have so many crazy ideas and, you know, they're so many flaky and metaphysically wrong and bad concepts and outlooks, why do they seem to be winning? Now, I of the opinion, or the saying goes, the devil always overplays his hand. I believe that. That being said, that doesn't mean we know what the fate of a lot of people and a lot of cultures and worlds is going to be. So I don't know that that's all decided. And surely we have some responsibility in that, each of us. So yeah, Adam and Eve, there was everything was perfect. Then they ate from the tree of the knowledge of wisdom, of knowledge of good and bad, good and evil. And then they fell and they entered into the world of duality. There had been no good or bad. It was just pure da-da-da. And so the question in this conversation was, okay, so they have crazy ideas, then why are they winning? And so he talked about Adam and Eve, the garden, and while the snake was allowed into the garden and temptation. But he also said he asks himself this question every day. He didn't feel he had a satisfactory answer as to why the bad guys, if they have such crazy ideas, seem pretty effective. But then the Garden of Eden, he wonders why did God allow the snake into the garden? You know, wouldn't it have been better if it was just, you know, we just pick berries, you know, do a little dance, everything is great. And it's just that every day, you know? And so that's where he was like, why not just that? Like, why did God allow, it seems things would have been much better that way. Why allow the snake into paradise? My thought when I heard that was actually, honestly, I just said, honestly, I think the idea that it would just be berries, mating, and doing dances, doing a little, you know, dance in nature, this kind of perfect world, it's actually not that interesting, right? That actually would get old very fast. If we play that out, if we think about doing that all the time, I mean, I don't know if I'm alone here, but that would lose its magic pretty fast, no? And maybe some of us would say, no, that sounds pretty decent compared to what we're living now. But then I think this arguably, well, there's maybe why the bad guys are able to get in there. I mean, if the ideal is this perfect garden, Adam and Eve style, berries and, you know, dance and all these, you know, happy things. If that's it becomes easy to corrupt people technically, right? Like there's not necessarily goodness, truth, beauty. These aren't things we know. that we have self-consciously had to strive for, right? Everything is just already, there's no stress, there's no inertia, there are no forces sort of forcing us to come up with our own ideas, right? To use our creativity, to use our powers of hypothesis to generate new concepts, right? Which, if we're truly in the image of God, right, if every individual has a divine spark, and we are in that image by virtue of our capacity to create, right, to do good, to envision things that aren't, but could be, right, and that to have the moral fortitude, courage, acumen to execute, to make these things happen. I mean, if everything is perfect, early garden stuff, then we don't really need any of that. So there's a great paradox around the question of the garden. What does getting back to the garden even mean? And I mean, why did Rembrandt, if the garden was so perfect, but yet it's the first man and woman? I mean, they don't look that in shape. They don't look like it doesn't look like it's the best living in the world. They're the first man and the first woman. So, I mean, this brings this question of the semines veritas, right? The seeds of truth. Is there a development? Is there, whether in faith, in reason, in our understanding of ourselves, do these things develop that we can do all these things wrong, right? That people can interpret things wrongly, or get the wrong message. That doesn't preclude the fact that these things do develop. So Cusa makes this point, right, that the seeds develop. The seeds of truth can be infinitely unfolded, but they require, if we're to do that, we need a certain epistemological development.
David?
Yeah.
You said we can intervene if we want to.
Yeah, for sure, because I'm just staring at my screen too, so I don't see everybody. So yeah,
I just have thinking about what you're saying and the Garden of Eden, and I'm wondering, okay, well, what necessity? I mean, I'm thinking that a lot of the scientific discoveries, or the drive for scientific discovery, was based on necessity, or the urge or the idea to do things in an easier way. Now, if you're in the Garden of Eden, I always had this idea that everything is perfect. So, okay, you don't need to improve anything, and therefore you just can be exist, I guess. Okay, I mean, I'm looking at this picture, I'm going like, okay, I guess we don't even need the need for clothes because they never have winter. Right? So, and then I thought, if I have that idea about this, there's no need, there's no drive to change anything, then what kind of existence would that actually be? That's just a thought I was thinking.
Yeah, I mean, the fun thing about these, sorry, why is my phone not? These myths, these are creation myths, right? So we can think about these things for a long time. I mean, if Adam and Eve is they are the children, first man, it's the childhood of mankind, it's the infancy of mankind. And there was a purity, we could say, or the infancy was before there was a purity, like pure child, everything is pure child awe and wonder. But then there's a fall, right? We taste of the fruit of duality. It's not, everything is not just happy and nice things. It's not just smiling faces, right? Mom and daddy always smile and everybody loves you, and it's everybody's catering to your needs. You're not scared, you're taken care of, you feel at home. And then you enter the world, right? The world of duality, of there is good and evil. We find out that it's not all just these nice things. Now the question is, can we make it to the other side of that duality? Right? What does that mean? What does that look like? That's the question that comes to my mind. This, just to keep it moving though, the second image, Prometheus. So we all know Prometheus. In comparison, actually, let's look at the other one first. So the bottom one is Mithra. Are people familiar with the Mithra legend? Okay, so the Mithra. Let's read a quote. Why are we looking at these other images? So Timothy Leary, in one of his autobiographies, talks about his discussion with Aldous Huxley. And he simply says, "We had run up against the Judeo-Christian commitment to one God, one religion, one reality that has cursed Europe for centuries and America since our founding days. Drugs that open the mind to realities inevitably lead to a polytheistic view of the universe. We sense that the time for a new humanist religion based on intelligence, good-natured pluralism, and scientific paganism had arrived." So, polytheistic view. So, Mithra is ancient Persian, Indo-European, or Indo-Persian, Indo-Iranian, god of fertility. And I'm just going to read the description here. I think it's just useful. So Mithra, also spelled Mithras, Sanskrit Mitra, in ancient Indo-Iranian mythology, the god of light, whose cult spread from India in the east to as far west as Spain, Great Britain, and Germany. Mithraism. The first written mention of the Vedic Mitra dates to 1400 BC. His worship spread to Persia, and after the defeat of the Persians by Alexander the Great, throughout the Hellenic world. In the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, the cult of Mithra, carried and supported by the soldiers of the Roman Empire, was the chief rival to the newly developing religion of Christianity. The Roman emperors Commodus and Julian were initiates of Mithraism, and in 307, Diocletian consecrated a temple on the Danube River to Mithra, protector of the empire. According to myth, Mithra was born, so Mithra is the young man there. Mithra was born bearing a torch and armed with a knife beside a sacred stream and under a sacred tree, a child of the earth itself. He soon rode and later killed the life-giving cosmic bull, whose blood fertilizes all vegetation. Mithra's slaying of the bull was a popular subject of Hellenic art and became the prototype for a bull-slaying ritual of fertility in the Mithraic cult. Now, we don't actually know that much about the Mithraic cults. We know, through the stuff that's left over, but there's a lot we don't know because it wasn't written down or anything. But so from here, if we go to the next slide, so we have the Mithra bull, and which is tied to fertility, and this over time also becomes Gaia, right? For the Greeks, the earth goddess, the goddess of fertility, the earth mother. And so man springs from this earth that was fertilized by the killing of the bull, the cosmic bull, by Mithra, who was born by a sacred stream under a sacred tree. The creation myths are quite, it's interesting to compare, right? Our idea of our origin, where we come from, when we get to the question of basic sense of identity, of basic self-image, our basic self-image is very much rooted in where we believe we came from. You know, what class, what kind of people, what are we really at the end of the day? Where have we come from? So these creation myths offer different views of that, with many subtleties and nuances that we can explore for a very long time. So in contrast to Mithros, was the cult, one of the main cults under the Roman Empire, among the army, the soldiers, and some of the emperors. Some of including the LaRouche hypothesizes, or you know, he claims that Augustus was made a deal with the priests of Mithra on the Isle of Capri, and that's what forged the actual Roman Empire as an empire. So yeah, these things we can unpack for a long time. So there's that image of the cosmic bull getting slayed, and at the top we have Prometheus, the fire bringer. Prometheus meaning foresight. He steals fire from the gods and gives it to man, who was otherwise in a pretty wretched and beastly state, living in unsunned caves and darkness, having no sense of time, right, of the seasons, pretty lost. And so Prometheus, the fire bringer, gives man knowledge of fire, and with that comes knowledge of the sciences, of astronomy, all these different things, these arts that man can use to develop himself and raise man out of the condition, the cattle-like condition that he was kept in by the Olympians. So that's another story, we could say. If we fast forward to today, so they're talking about, in this Changing Images of Man document, that we need an ecological ethic. We need to, man is not separate from nature, right? This idea of this Promethean mastery of nature, that needs to be put back into the bottle. Genie has to be put back in the bottle. But the thing is, there's always been progress, right? We all have this deeply rooted idea, and people can comment, just because I didn't know how long this was going to take. We could go on for a while. I mean, I just want to read some Huxley stuff, so I'll try and wrap it up shortly on this front. We'll look at some Huxley, and we can just comment and discuss. I imagine people might have thoughts. So there's this idea of progress, this Renaissance idea. Man can know the laws of the universe, and this is the problem, according to the mothership Luciferian brain trusts. You know, at the SRA, UCLA, these different places, the people doing work on this stuff, they don't like that. They don't like that image. And so it's really about how to reframe and recalibrate. So, you know, if we could look at the Mithra image, the bull, the Mithra cult, that becomes the pagan stuff, the earth goddess, earth worship, fertility. Man is a part of the ecosystem. Man is just another being, and you have pantheism, right, where pretty much God is everything, God is everywhere. And you know, we could say there's some truth to that, or properly understood, that doesn't it makes sense, you know, but then God is in the rocks, God is in, you can show it now, the other image, but yeah, as a background, as we discuss, God is everywhere. So that's the pantheistic view. But that, if God is everywhere, then is there really a distinction between man, and which is made in the image of the creator, and the rest of the beasts and the rest of nature? Are we allowed to make that distinction or not? How we frame our story, there are a lot of implications. And so there is this idea of progress, because there is this Promethean idea. So what did the bad guys come up with? Okay, so this is fun. This is kind of a nice trick. So they write, the new paradigm will likely incorporate some kind of concept of hierarchical level of consciousness or levels of subjective experience. These will be distinguishable in the sense that concepts and metaphors appropriate to one level do not necessarily fit another. They will be hierarchical, not in the sense that one is higher than another on some value scale, but in the sense of structural hierarchy, and also in the sense that the consciousness of intense moments of creativity are accompanied by, in some testable meaning, more awareness than times of ordinary consciousness. And those in turn involve more awareness than deep sleep. The notion of a spectrum of potential consciousness connotes extending the range of recognized unconscious processes of which we are not usually conscious, although the potentiality appears to be present, of experiencing them directly, to include a vast range of reported experience in the provinces of creative imagination, cosmic consciousness, aesthetic and mystical experience, psychic phenomena, and the occult. Telepathy, fast forward a bit, telepathy, the perception of another person's ongoing mental activities without the use, they give examples. So telepathy, the perception of another person's ongoing mental activities without the use of any sensory means of communication. Clairvoyance, the ability to know directly information or facts about events occurring in remote locations without normal sensory means. Precognition, the ability to know events or happenings in the future without sensory or inferential means of knowing. And I mean, they say psychokinesis. They don't think there's much promise in that one, but they also, the movement of matter by non-physical means or direct mental influence over physical objects or systems, telekinesis. But so they do a switch from what they identify as external material progress, which even when we frame it that way, right? So we're associating Renaissance man and man in the image of God and being able to unearth the natural laws of the universe for the betterment of mankind as associated with materialism, right? Material external progress. And so we can't get rid of progress, but you don't just need material progress, right? You have to have spiritual progress, right? We have progress in our consciousness and our awareness too, right? And the more we do that, the more of our self we are actualizing. We're becoming a fully self-actualized, fully aware person. Doesn't sound bad necessarily, right? So this is the gist of it. And again, the article is going to come out. It's going to be much more detailed. But so this switch from the age of abundance, as they call it, to a new scarcity, right? So we have to do less with more. That doesn't mean we can't develop. That doesn't mean we can't experience spirituality and all the good things that we're told is what's missing in modern man, in modern society. We can have all those things. So that's what they're saying. And if we look today, I mean, it's a pretty popular idea, understandably so, right? People feel disenfranchised. So I don't know if people have any comments. I think I saw messages. Otherwise, I would just, so this is Huxley's Island pretty much. So in a very short fashion, with the shift now being towards this spiritual consciousness and self-actualization, and how do you develop the proper curriculums, right? The proper schools, the proper family systems that are amenable to creating fully self-actualized people who are in harmony with themselves, right? They're not just good versus evil and a constant struggling with duality. They're aware, they're present. This is what they look at. If we're bad guys, we want to give people a sense that they're fulfilled, right? That's the most important. So if people aren't fulfilled, what can we offer them that will help them, right? If we're bad guys, how would we go approaching that? So that's the thought experiment. I don't know if people have any thoughts. Otherwise, I mean, why don't we just read some fun passages from the island?
So I'm sorry. I'm just confused a little bit. So they're saying let's limit conceptually and then really limit people's expression in the material world, so that it would therefore limit their spiritual growth, although they say it doesn't. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that they're saying this is how we need to. They're saying we need to focus less on the material, right? Now, again,
yeah, okay.
Their language. So they're saying you'll be more spiritual, right? Because
by focusing less on the material.
There's no more bread and circus, right? Western industrial civilization is being canned. It's over, right? That this is how the bad guys are thinking. So it's not going to be Brave New World. There's not going to be the bread and circus. That's you can't afford the bread and circus anymore. That's where we're headed now. It's not going to be abundance. It's scarcity.
So, but they're purposely limiting the abundance in order to do this.
Well, that's the thing. There are a lot of rabbit holes, right? That we like. Yeah. Is there really scarcity and But my purpose here was not. I'm not plugging them, but you see that the arguments are more subtle than I think some people like to make them out, and that's partly why a lot of well-meaning people aren't necessarily able to route these things, because they don't. They're not necessarily get in there. They're coming at it from just a very strict doctrinal approach. Mm-hmm. But I mean, the snake is in the garden. You know, if Huxley talks about this, I think if we read the novel, I mean, there's some great passages. But what happens if you tell somebody, in all the work I've done researching the hypnosis stuff, Richard Bandler, who's the founder of co-creator of neurolinguistic programming, he makes a good point. Again, he was a student of Gregory Bateson, sketchy background, but he says, if I tell you what happens when I say don't think about the color blue? What are you thinking about? What happens when a parent says don't do this? What happens when we tell somebody don't do this? Have we ever been given advice in our life where somebody said, hey, well, you shouldn't do that, or hey, you should really do that? How often have we ever listened? How often has anybody ever taken good advice? Right? Most of history is people not taking good advice. If we think about it, it's rare that somebody will take good advice and act on it and not fall. Right? Why is that?
Okay. Yeah.
So Susan, having had a question, she has her hand up.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm looking for my phone.
I was just gonna ask, so is part of what you're saying and part of what you're reading, they are hoping to now direct and facilitate in their own way our next level of spiritual growth to evolve to the place that they want us to be, instead of us, finding our own way. Would that be a good way of rewording what you're saying?
I think there's a recognition, and I think we can all agree here, people have a spiritual longing, right? There's a spiritual desire in everybody, right? This is written about by all the theologians, and there's an itch, right? The body needs food for the soul and food for the body. We need food for the soul and food for the body. And if we don't get one, we look for it somewhere else. That's just the reality. The bad guys know that, right? They're not stupid. And so there was a period where we could all be distracted, modern man, with, consumerism and but
Right.
we can go back to the old documents. It's always that, like, this is temporary. We need to go back to the pre-Renaissance times. We need to go back to a more sustainable time, right, where man was in balance with Mother Nature, right, before man had fallen, right? So, you know, flashback to Adam and Eve, right? That myth is being, so they're always recombining, right? The empires will always use syncretic cults, right? They will recombine images of gods and whatnot. And I think sometimes we wonder, I've asked this many times, like, what do the bad guys really believe? You know, do they worship, with, Satan with plastic devil horns, or like, what are they doing? And da-da-da. But at the end of the day, I think if you look at it as in one of the lectures, Webster Tarpley, who's did some good work in the past, he made a point. Oligarchy has one goal: preserve oligarchy. They'll change their beliefs. If their beliefs are not helping them maintain control, they'll become Christian. They don't care. That's not their oligarchy is there to preserve oligarchy. And so I think appreciating the subtle changes in the images gives us a sense of what they're trying to offer. And they recognize that there's people are feeling spiritually today. So we got to give them something, right? But we can't. We have to depopulate. They all this assumes that there's finite resources and the population has to be reduced. But they don't emphasize that. They just emphasize, they frame it as, Mother Earth and all these things. So not being nice to Mother Earth, not dirtying it, right? Because that's shameful. That's bad. I mean, I hear people, when you hear people talk today, I mean, at least in Montreal, like, I mean, I've heard they feel bad about, like, not recycling, or like they have eco anxiety or whatever. I've heard these things, like, if they're people are being repatterned.
There's a whole language that they speak in, and they all speak it, and then they wait to see if you're in on the language, like sustainable.
You're a bad person otherwise. You're sick. It's funny how it
that
comes
part I
circle.
get. I understand that part, but you're talking about they're deliberately trying to misdirect or reframe how people access free will in order to, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're introduced to a false set of choices, right? So these are binds. This is also hypnosis, right? We're introducing the choice between to pollute or not to pollute, right? Or as Huxley says in the island, to scoot or not to scoot, right? The people of Pala, which is the imagined island, the utopian island. So this is the utopian flip side of the dystopian Brave New World coin. And the soon to be king, the heir, Murugan, who's still a young boy, he likes what the other islands, Rangdang Lobo has. They have scooters, they have industrialism, and they have a strongman, Colonel Deepa, who runs it, and they have a bunch of nice things. But for some reason, the people in Pala don't want all these things. They don't want consumerism and industrial stuff. They're not swayed. But Murugan, there's all sorts of background stories. He's looking for it to be the king so that he can modernize Pala. And so, to have industrial society or to not have industrial society, they just give us binds like that. It's easy to give false choices. And unless we're aware, we've all been given false choices. We've all had presented ourselves or with false choices. This is one of the things that they look at in NLP, in hypnosis, right? That your NLP at its base is giving people choice. That's one of the things they'll say. Is we assume things are a certain way in our life. We have certain beliefs, and we verbalize that whole thing in just a simple descriptive, statement on our situation. well, I have to do this because I have to do that, so I can't do that. But the question is there not, we may be giving ourselves limiting beliefs or false choices, and that's on us. So it works both ways. These things false choices they're clever tricks. So yeah, I think I'll just read a fun passage from the island.
So, before you do that, David, can you, there's a question about what are the approximate dates of Huxley's 2 books?
Well, Huxley's The Island is the last book and is the last thing he wrote, and it is published 1962.
1962.
Brave New World is what, isn't this 1940s?
Yeah, that's what I thought, yes.
Yeah, like The Island is a much more mature take. And I think it's much more interesting, and it's much closer to the kind of thing, if we want to look at what's going on now, this is pretty compelling. So yeah, all that to say, so from the age of abundance to new scarcity, we have there's a spiritual longing in people, and we see it with the way people emote with nature, right? Nature is this pure and sacred thing. And I mean, it's not maybe wrong to think that at a certain level, but as we've all been camping, right? We could say, sure, that sounds nice at first, but yeah, farming creates a lot of pollution, all these things, they're bad, right? Cars, but like, what happens like day 5 camping? I mean, it's nice till day 2, but then you want to go home and take a shower.
Sleep in the real bed.
Yeah, you want real water.
Yes.
So, I mean, a lot of these things are, how do you sell these nice images, right? How do you make them in a way that they speak to people, right? So nature, we're going to get back in touch with ourselves and with everything, and it's going to be fun. So that's why one of the sections in this article is called from Soma, which is the Brave New World drug, from Soma to Moksha. So we are in this world. I mean, I think we're very much in a phase where there's an attempt to go from Soma to Moksha. People are tired of taking pills. They're tired of taking that. So now they're thinking of, transcendent. And whether we're watching Joe Rogan or Jordan Peterson or listening to all sorts of people who, have been through trauma or troubles, and the message is the same. I took psychedelics, I took DMT. I had a conversation with the entities, and I feel a lot better now. And I feel more in touch with myself, and I'm more in touch with people. Will say very interesting things. Like, I'm not there to poo-poo it all. But the question is, what's the bigger picture, right? Like, if we really want to understand what's going on, is that the whole picture? So I'm going to read something, and then I'm going to close with a quote, and people can say, people have any comments or anything, we can just leave it at that. So 164. So Murugan, who's the king, was just discussing, clamoring. They're talking about progress, and the reporter who's crashed onto this island, who is shipwrecked, works for Joe Aldehyde, a big, newspaper industrialist tycoon. So Murugan frowned and shook his head. It wouldn't work. They're talking about whether Pala would go like Rangdang Lobo and industrialize. So the main character says, you mean they wouldn't be tempted? Not even by sleek speedsters and whisper pink bras? But that's incredible. It may be incredible, said Murugan bitterly, but it's a fact. They're just not interested. Not even the young ones? I'd say especially the young ones. Wolf Farnaby picked up his ears. This lack of interest was profoundly interesting. Can you guess why? He asked. I don't guess, the boy answered. I know. And as though he had suddenly decided to stage a parody of his mother, he began to speak in a tone of righteous indignation that was absurdly out of keeping with his age and appearance. To begin with, they're much too busy with ... He hesitated, Then the abhorred word hissed out with a disgustful emphasis. With sex! But everybody's busy with sex, which doesn't keep them from whoring after sleek speedsters. Sex is different here, Mergen insisted. Because of the yoga of love, Will asked, remembering the little nurse's rapturous face. The boy nodded. They've got something that makes them think they're perfectly happy and they don't want anything else. What a blessed state. There's nothing blessed about it, Merrigan snapped. It's just stupid and disgusting. No progress, only sex, sex, sex. And of course, that beastly dope they're all given. Dope? Will repeated in some astonishment. Dope, in a place where Susila had said there were no addicts? What kind of dope? It's made out of toadstools. Toadstools. He spoke in a comical caricature of the Rani's vibrant tone of outraged spirituality. Those lovely red toadstools that gnomes used to sit on? No, these are yellow. People used to go out and collect them in the mountains. Nowadays, the things are grown in special fungus beds at the high-altitude experimental station. Scientifically cultivated dope. Pretty, isn't it? A door slammed and there was a sound of voices, of footsteps approaching along a corridor. I'm going to just skip. It was he to get on Cabbages, King's Motors. Just keep going. A door slammed and there was a sound of voices, of footsteps approaching along a corridor. Abruptly, the indignant spirit of the Rani took flight, and Mergen was once again the conscience-stricken schoolboy furtively trying to cover up his delinquencies. In a Trice elementary ecology had taken the place of Sears, Roebuck, and this suspiciously bulging briefcase was under the table. They were looking at a magazine of all the, like a Sears catalog for that. They were Murugan, who's going to be the king, is hoping to get all these things. But he's up against an obstacle, the Pala Moksha culture. A moment later, stripped to the waist and shining like oiled bronze with sweat of labor in the noonday sun, Vijaya came striding into the room. Behind him came Dr. Robert, with the air of a model student interrupted in the midst of his reading by trespassers from the frivolous outside world. Mergen looked up from his book, amused. Will threw himself at once wholeheartedly into the part that had been assigned to him. It was I who got here too early, he said, in response to Vijaya's apologies for their being so late. With the result that our young friend here hasn't been able to get on with his lessons. We've been talking our heads off. What about? Dr. Robert asked. Everything, cabbages, kings, motors, scooters, pendulous abdomens. And when you come in, we just embarked on toadstools. Mergen was telling me about the fungi that are used here as a source of dope. What's in a name? Said Dr. Roberts with a laugh. Answer, practically everything. Having had the misfortune to be brought up in Europe, Mergen calls it dope and feels about it all the disapproval that by conditioned reflex, the dirty word evokes. We, on the contrary, give the stuff good names. The Moksha medicine, the reality revealer, the truth and beauty pill. And we know by direct experience that the good names are deserved. Whereas our young friend here has no firsthand knowledge of the stuff and can't be persuaded even to give it a try. For him, it's dope, and dope is something that, by definition, no decent person ever indulges in. What does His Highness say to that? Will asked. Mergen shook his head. All it gives you is a lot of illusions, he muttered. Why should I go out of my way to be made a fool of? Why indeed, said Vijaya with good-humored irony. Seeing that, in your normal condition, you alone of the human race are never made a fool of and never have illusions about anything. I never said that, Mergen protested. All I mean is that I don't want any of your false samadhi. How do you know it's false? Dr. Robert inquired. Because the real thing only comes to people after years and years of meditation and tapas and ... well, you know, not going with women. Mergen, Vijaya explained to Will, is one of the Puritans. He's outraged by the fact that with 400 milligrams of moksha medicine in their bloodstreams, even beginners, yes, and even boys and girls who make love together can catch a glimpse of the world as it looks to someone who has been liberated from his bondage to the ego. But it isn't real, Murrigan insisted. Not real, Dr. Roberts repeated. You might as well say the experience of feeling well isn't real. You're begging the question, Will objected. An experience can be real in relation to something going on inside your skull, but completely irrelevant to anything outside. Of course, Dr. Robert agreed. Do you know what goes inside your skull when you've taken a dose of the mushroom? We know little, and we're trying all the time to find out more, Vijaya added. So we could go on. Now we'll just shift. So we're just about to close here. Keep this in mind as we think about where our society's actually going, So I think we're fast forward to page 227. In theological terms, said Vijaya, the moksha medicine prepares one for the reception of gratuitous graces, pre-mystical visions, or the full-blown mystical experience. Meditation is one of the ways in which one cooperates with those gratuitous graces. How? By cultivating the state of mind that makes it possible for the dazzling ecstatic insights to become permanent and habitual illuminations. By getting to know oneself to the point where one won't be compelled to by one's unconscious do all the ugly, absurd, self-stultifying things that one so often finds oneself doing. We could go on. So there's a lot of fun passages, but I'll just close with this quote, thinking about what does this world look like, in contrast to what does this utopia? I mean, some of it sounds nice, being aware, not being always at a struggle, caught up in duality, being present, removing illusions about oneself, about others, which arguably is the reason that, is the source of unhappiness for many of us, for everyone, right? To the degree we live in illusions, is it whether we feel happy or not? So isn't that, removing illusions doesn't sound like a bad thing. But now, so I'm gonna close with a quote from, do I have the actual book? I have the quote from Tom O'Neill's Chaos, Charles Manson and the Secret Histories of the 1960s. So we're being given all this, there's a renewed surge in mysticism and an interest in spirituality. I mean, this has been around for a while, but if the bad guys don't want people to discover the real thing, to rediscover the real thing, right, or to rediscover our own story, right, as even they're quite conscious of in terms of the shift in Western civilization, which unleashed the greatest record of progress that's ever been seen in civilization, right, in terms of scientific development and all that, because it wasn't just there were tribes, we had traditions, and we had all these things, but there was also the idea that each individual had a direct connection to, through their mind, through their creativity, a unique power to hypothesize. So you don't learn that from mommy and daddy. You don't learn that from just copying other people. That's not something that can be judged by your tribe or social group can determine for you, which is historically, morality, all these things, stress on morality and rituals, practices, these things you get from being around people. But the idea that you can discover something new that's never been discovered, or have a thought that's never been thought about before, creativity on the deepest level, that there was an upshift with the Renaissance around this idea, and that's what they don't like. And so a return to spirituality, yes, a lot of people are for that today. But what does it mean? So Tom O'Neill, in his great book, Chaos, Charles Manson and the Secret History of the 60s, talks about Charles Manson and the family and the experiments that were being done at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. And he dug up some papers from the researchers, some of them who were directly attending to Manson and his family. And they're looking at LSD, so they're looking at psychedelics. He says, one of these articles hoped to find out whether a dramatic drug-induced experience would have a lasting impact on the individual's personality. Another observed that feelings of frustrated anger led people to want to try LSD. Quote, the soil from which the flower children arise, the author wrote, is filled more with anger and aggression, thorns and thistles, rather than passion and petunias. Under quote unquote emotional pressure, acid could induce quote images and sensations of anger or hate magnified into nightmarish proportions, close quote. David Smith had studied these same phenomena, formulating an idea that he called the psychedelic syndrome, first articulated in 1967 or early 68. The gist was that acid, when taken by groups of like-minded people, led to a quote-unquote chronic LSD state that reinforced the interpretation of psychedelic reality. The more often the same group of quote-unquote friends dropped acid, the more they encouraged one another to adopt the worldview they discovered together on LSD, thus producing quote-unquote dramatic psychological changes. Usually the psychedelic syndrome was harmless, but regular LSD use could cause quote, the emergence of a dramatic orientation to mysticism, close quote. So this is MK Ultra, this is MK Ultra research, in real time that was around Manson and all that. And so they're looking at how do we, again, the first question we're asking, how do people undergo fundamental transformations in their self-image? In their basic self-image? How do we repattern the feelings, right? The affective systems is what Gregory Bateson and them, they look at when they're the cyberneticists. It's not just your ideas or your thoughts, it's the emotional, it's the affectation you have towards any one given set of images. Green grass, clean water, fresh air, right? Those are nice things. We don't have enough of those. So, yeah, I think all that to say, it's important. We want to have the bigger picture, right? When a lot of people have legitimate, grievances, and there's a lot of things wrong with our current sick Western society. So it's obvious that people are gonna look for alternatives. But the theme throughout this paper is it an imitation? Or is it the real thing? Is it something that, as even Huxley in the book says, makes us feel like we are fully fulfilled, that we are fully self-actualized? Is it the real thing, or is it just something that makes us feel as though it is? And how would we know? We need to know our longer story, I would say, if we're gonna get into the thick of it. We all need to know our own individual story. We need to know the story of man. And some of these bad guys, they know it pretty well. They know it better than the average well-meaning person might. And so, yeah, I think we need to get our story straight. I'll just end it there.
Thank you, David. One thought I also had after what you said is there's actually, so the idea would be to create new group think, I guess, okay? And there's probably besides the use of mushrooms, I'm sure there's other ways to do it also. I think dramatic experiences like wars, or dramatic experiences like what we just went through with COVID, okay? That would definitely also create a change in the perception and in the impressions and emotions of the population. That's what I'm thinking, but Well, maybe you
Yeah,
can say something to that.
yeah, I mean, that's technically, again, there's a lot of rabbit holes here, so
Yeah.
forgive me if I rambled a bit, but yeah, trauma is the one, going back to family therapy, the main, like, inducing trauma. You know, I was thinking actually about this today. If we want to, family therapy, they look at trauma and you can induce altered states, right? People are still acting out trauma even long after it's happened. If we look at here today, I mean, let's say the radical feminism, right? The idea, there's an interesting one, because feminism is, you know, the idea of compassion, all that mankind needs that, and there was an emphasis on that, but there's different waves of feminism, and one notices right today in the very aggressive sort of liberal the spread of aggression and violence among liberal people. You know, Tim Dillon, the podcaster that I like to listen to, is comedian. You know, he's talking about speeches that were canceled by different conservative writers, where what are they all screaming? What are the kids screaming as they're like throwing milkshakes with cement in them at people's heads and stuff? They're saying safety, safety, safety. How are people who are somebody who's big on protecting the vulnerable, right, and having compassion and not oppressing, how are they, how is that, how is the trigger to get them to act violently, how is that done? Well, what happens when the mama bear thinks her cubs are threatened? Mama bear will kill you. Right? So what happens if you frame something as you're attacking a more vulnerable group? You're attacking a minority. You're preying on the weaker. You're just some predator bully attacking. What do you have to, you step in, right? So safety, right? There's this language that is there to induce. They say it's, you know, so they'll use words like even feminism, but it's not really about femininity, right? That the bad guys are looking to trigger certain defaults and to weaponize them in programming and use that to shape the group, right? So you hear it, rape culture, right? Like rape is a real thing, and there's a lot of it, and there's been a lot of it historically.
Yeah.
But what happens if you start to make people feel like they've been raped even when they haven't? Collectively, right? That there's this threat, all these imminent threats. This is
and also, David, could you say also that there's a reward system involved also? Like you can't be successful unless you just stop thinking here for a moment and just realize that if you just go and you know, like with the artwork that's kind of psychedelic, that's really popular nowadays, we'll promote you. If you just think this way, or there's rewards and pleasures to be had infinitely, supposedly, if you just, you know, buy into the program.
Well, that's group dynamics, right? There's what is virtue signaling, right? It's a status thing, and this is family therapy, right? It all starts with the family. And why do people, all the games, and people in dysfunctional families, they play all sorts of games, they fall in line, and people are saying certain things because they're supposed to say certain things. And then you go to groups. What are tribes? What are our political parties? Or whether tribes in school, you know, being, you know, you want to be cool, all that. They're all extended families, right? Tribes are just a form of extended family system. And so by just modeling the dynamics of the family, how do you then leverage these different things like responses to trauma or responses to shame, right? Because shame is one of the big ones. And it's hypothesized that shame is an evolutionary thing as well. Like shame is the threat of you being expelled from the tribe. If you don't play nicely, right, you're out of the tribe, which in evolutionary terms means you're as good as dead. And so the threat of expulsion and shame as this thing that keeps everybody in line to make sure they play nice, you leverage that. So how do you shame people collectively, right? So that if most people are agreeable, which most people are, right? Like not everybody's, you know, you could say the majority of people are agreeable. They're not going to, you know, they're going to go with the flow. They don't want any trouble. So how do you then use shame to zero in on the outliers, maybe the 15%? And with the right stuff, you can whittle that down to 5% or 2%, right? Until there's almost nobody. So like it's a numbers game. And what do we need to do to keep that as a self or regulating system as well? It's not imposed from the top. So how do you put out how do you create the patterning, the affectation, so that people come to regard one image as this and another as positive and the other one as negative, like preying on.
So they give they give a positive and a negative at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, that unlike the mechanics, there's so much, right? That's the thing about the bad guys, I'd say, is they're thorough, right? They're looking at everything. Whereas, you know, a lot of well-meaning people, they have their ideas, they believe in, you know, you look out for yourself and you don't, you know, you live your life, you take care of your family and but you're not necessarily thinking about all the bigger picture stuff, top down. And if most people aren't, then, I mean, it's not that hard to introduce new reward systems and like change the language incrementally and use different events to then, you know, more forest fires. Oh my God, we're all, you know, this is what we get, right? Like people are freaking out now because of simultaneous forest fires popping up everywhere, strangely.
Yeah.
And
by the positive, I meant like that part of the whole thing is, oh, you're unique. You're special. You're unique. You know, and at the same time, they're going,
yeah,
like little stars on the refrigerator.
yeah.
I on the list here, several Dars has been waiting very patiently. He had comments. Okay, he had some comments, Dars, and then I would like Susan Errett from the Rising Tide. I think she had a couple of comments, and I think I saw Susan Hoffman had her hand up too, but now it's down, so I don't know. Now it's back up again. Okay, so we go in that order. Darcy, you want to say have a comment? You're on mute. Okay. Well, maybe we get back to him. Susan, you have something to say?
Well, it was just about the magic mushrooms, the comment with the magic mushrooms, because it's in our society. This is a normal thing. This is from nature. The same with pot. These are recreational, good things, you know, because they came from nature, they're good things. So I'm 63. My friends are mostly in their late 60s, and they've been doing the same. So I was lucky when I tried like magic mushrooms and acid back in the 70s. I had a really bad downer, never tried them again. I'm still with the same friends. I still have many of the same friends who've been smoking pot and mushrooms every day for like 40 years now or more. And they still remember that their excuse is because it gives me enlightenment. It is good for me. I feel better. But yet those feelings of betterness are much rarer than the down parts, right? And the lack of all the money and time that's spent just doing drugs. So I just question a lot of the people who are younger seeing it as a normal thing, not seeing it as an addiction, because being from nature doesn't make it good. That was my only comment.
Okay, thank you. Susan Hoffman?
Yeah, I just gotta say, I went through a stage when I was young where I was smoking marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
It really messes up your long-term memory.
Yeah.
Well, your short-term memory too. It messes with your memory. So if people have continued smoking it for years, what must it be doing to their mind? I mean, I found when I quit, my memory returned to normal.
Right.
So these people's minds must be really, really affected by now.
Yeah, at the same
Anyway,
I
go
know
on.
I would agree, but as I hear you speak, I mean, I think it's important that we acknowledge, like, why are a lot of people getting high all the time, right? If we look at what's available to them, I mean, there's not much, right? Like our culture has been sort of destroyed.
Yep.
And I don't say that to be a downer, right? But it's more in the sense that, like, it's only by, like, calling the thing what it is, putting a name on it,
Yep.
and acknowledging the problem, that's when it actually, now say, okay, we've hit rock bottom. That's actually good news.
Yeah.
It actually feels nice.
Right.
Because now we can, like, actually do things, and we're sober. We can have a sober vision of, and we have all this history, right? Like the Renaissance is a real thing. Western civilization, there's a reason the bad guys have to be so meticulous, and so much work, right, goes into, from like the silver screen in Hollywood to all the different culture, the Soma cultures, right? The entertainment industry and the drug industry, which is part of literally the Soma, but it's just one expression, really. So
Okay.
people
Dave, you think so broadly that I would like to go back a moment and just recapture a couple of points that you made there, because isn't the reality of things like marijuana, aren't we simply anesthetizing the pain that we don't know how to overcome?
Well, I think that's where ultimately, again, we have to, why are people, if people had a lot of motivation to do things, and, you know, this is why, like, what's popular among the young folks today, I think this is actually pretty interesting, right? You know, things like self-actualization in the Nietzschean idea, right? The Dionysus treated as the liberator, right? The light bringer. The Dionysian strives, right? He longs to do things, right? He wants to have honor and glory and to strive for greatness, right? And so what's interesting is that, and like, even I was reading a decent thread on Twitter by like an Orthodox, very famous Orthodox speaker. He makes the point that Nietzsche saw that a lot of the people around him were the justification, you know, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Very important, you know, the third beatitude from the Sermon on the Mount. But what happens if people just use these kind of things to just be very basic, and, you know, Nietzsche calls it the slave morality, right? You just fall in line, you just do what everybody else is doing. It's just conformity, right? There's one extreme of radical individualism, but I mean, is conformity really the highest virtue? Like, we just shame anybody who doesn't look and sound just like everybody else. Like, that was a big thing, right? Back in the more conservative days, right? If you're not sort of falling into the mold, you're whatever. So that's a legitimate flip side of, we can see why people are like, this is lame, this is dumb. And the young folks, they want, they want to strive for greatness. You know, there's this idea, and it takes on this Nietzschean spiritual eugenics idea, which is actually becoming quite popular. But you can play around with it.
David, could we say that whenever there's trauma, when a person is going to, in a social situations, they're going to want to act out whatever, they're not fully conscious of their anger or something like that, and so they're going to act out the trauma, and so in order to mitigate the possible growth and damage that can happen by doing that, then we'll just give you this drug, you know, as a nihilistic goal that you can define, instead of you're on your own in the world of trying to find yourself.
Yeah, but there's the selling point though for moksha, right? In our modern moksha, it's not there to get you high. DMT is just 15 minutes, Like if you listen to people and their DMT experiences, again, I'm a curious guy, and it's interesting, and they don't, it's like people report positive, the entities are like, it's interesting, it's fun to listen to. I mean, but people will say that it's very had positive impacts for them, before they were not online at all, and they start to sort of, they're liberated, right? This is what Huxley is, again, like the idea of breaking away from the herd and becoming self-actualized, leaving your dysfunctional family, right? That's another big one. R.D. Laing talks a lot about this, and this was a big thing with the politics of the family, that the idea of transcendence and leaving all this dysfunction behind to become your true, fully actualized self. There's another interesting movie. I will watch The Island, as somebody mentioned, but there's a movie called The Beach with Leonardo DiCaprio. I don't know if anybody's seen that. It's well done. They all different people. They're all outcasts, or like they left behind, they had some other life, and they all meet on an island. And it's like they're pursuing their full life, and all sorts of drama happens, and like it's, there's a twist, and it's, it's a like dark drama, but it starts off all nice and da-da-da, and the theme is very much this Langian sort of leaving behind the dysfunction, right? Because he saw that a lot of people, the schizophrenics that he saw, the family system was sick, and they got better when they were away from the family system, but they fell apart once they went back home. Like a year later, everything came undone. And so you have these things, right? That trauma is therefore something that you can also, people are like, yeah, I want to escape all that. And so now what should people be striving for? And so open spirituality, striving for greatness. That's why there's some funny stuff out there. Bronze Age pervert, Bronze Age mindset. This is very popular among young people. The idea of going back to the Bronze Age, where like people are, against the longhouse, they'll say, exiting the longhouse, the sort of matriarchal, nanny state thing, and having real warriors, people that are willing to die for greatness and glory and all these things. And this stuff is very popular today. So like the Bronze Age as a remedy to modern man with his Excel sheets. I read a tweet that said if Augustus Caesar had to just stare at spreadsheets every day, he wouldn't be able to get out of bed either. They're not wrong, right, on that. But you see how this is used to then take people down a whole thing, to repattern, right? We see how the repatterning starts to happen.
Dars, are you still there? And can you vocalize now what you wanted to say? Or are we still having problems with the phone?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh, now we can hear you, yes.
Oh, cool. Yeah. I originally I wasn't even gonna say anything. I was just like writing in the chat. But now just on the point of like drugs and psychedelics and stuff like that. I think there is benefits to it, but with any drugs, there's always the dangers too. But I think like the bad guys, they take things that are there to benefit us, and they kind of hijack it. It's like taking truth, mixing it with other things. So it's kind of hijacked. Like, just in my opinion, I think there is benefits.
No, sure, yeah. Nobody's again, that's why even in my paper, like I say, it's not to poo-poo, anybody who's had positive experiences. The purpose was to present the bigger picture, though. Like, we can have all these discussions, but how many of the people who are going to have these discussions are really have intimate understanding of these parts of our story, right? Of Western civilization story with the Renaissance, what really happened, the fundamental shift that occurred, pre sort of feudal European, like the feudal Dark Ages, the idea of individuals and the sacredness of individuals. It wasn't really, there wasn't anything to act on. Like, it was not, You know, if your father was a serf, you're a serf. You know, there wasn't this
Mhm.
idea of the sacredness, and there's a spark. And how do we develop that spark? Now, we can argue whether, you know, different drugs or whatnot are going to help us develop that. But I mean, if we look at a Beethoven or an Einstein, or like, how did these great minds think? I mean, that would be my first sort of like pushback. Like, are we studying the classics? Are we studying the great timeless works throughout, you know, the classical tradition? Are we really, if we want to have a renaissance, right, which isn't just like a throwback to the past, but it's really a rediscovery within our own age of the timeless and transcendent truths that have animated our civilization, you know, keeping in mind what the bad guys are up to, keeping in mind that quote I read from Tom O'Neill's book, like the MK Ultra, the repatterning, the psychedelics, it helps you take emotional distance from the past, right? That's what people report. So they say that it'll help them with trauma because they're able to take an emotional distance. They're not so, they don't feel ensnared to things that from the past. So that can work both ways, right? In a controlled setting, God bless, you know, if it helps, it helps. But what we want to be aware of what the bigger picture is. There's a reason that, you know, when you see all this stuff, as popular as it is, keeping in mind these themes of from the age of abundance to new scarcity, the post-industrialization of the West, we want to have the full story if we're going to have a sober conversation about what this is all about, and, you know, how do we get to the real thing?
Yeah. So the larger kind of picture of reality, I know what you're saying. I suppose my point would just be, it's kind of as an aside, but it's more,
yeah,
for me, just real quick, I'll mention it kind of stops a repetitive pattern in your thinking.
Yeah, no, that's well known. Yeah, there's no argument.
It's a very small kind of aside to the bigger picture that you were talking about, I suppose.
Susan, thank you, Doris.
Yeah, thanks.
Susan, do you have anything to ask or comment?
Well, I actually didn't get around to asking the question I was going to ask, which is, Dave, what is your understanding or the definition or whatever of mysticism? What does that mean?
I had a whole thing. I have tons of notes, and I was like, I rambled as long as I did, and I didn't want to go down that rabbit hole. But there was a whole section that I was like, okay, how far a rabbit hole are we going to go for that? There's a great book. I have an anthology of mysticism. This is a great anthology, and I mean, mysticism. Let me just read for what it says right here, actually, just because it's simple. But I mean, here, rather than mysticism involves, right there, there's the idea of transcendence, right? When you're getting to the mystical experiences, whether we're, you know, this is coming up with the moksha, our moksha psychedelic culture, transcending and having a mystical experience. So often that's associated with transcending the dualities, right? Transcending the binds and having an experience of, you know, people will say oneness and da-da-da. If we think at the highest level, I mean, you have when Paul writes, you know, so now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face, right? That's the beatific vision, right? This is what Dante records in the final canto of Paradise, where when Dante is looking into the blinding light and he can look no further, what's the last thing that he sees is an image of a human face, right? As he's looking into the divine light, he sees an image of himself, right? This is the idea of man made in the image of God. And so that we're transcending and getting in touch fully with this deeper our deeper nature, right? And all the things that get in the way of that. I think that's where, so the mysticism then, it takes on many different, it's very paradoxical, like Cusa, who calls his approach, Nicholas of Cusa in Learned Ignorance, he calls it a mystical theology. And, it makes the point that the brightest light, right, the most divine light, it's the most bright, it's actually absolute darkness. Because to the degree that it can get any more brighter, it's not the most bright. So necessarily then the brightest of lights is actually complete darkness. Likewise, silence, right? The greatest truth is not anything that we could utter, any particular. It's actually the greatest truth that one can experience is an experience of total absolute silence. And we could go on. St. John of the Cross, one of the most important Christian mystics, or St. Teresa of Avila, right? He talks about the two nights of the soul. So the first night of the soul, both are like a death. The first is the death of the purgation of the self, of the body, in terms of all its connections to just to the things that fade, to the material. That's the first night of the soul. And the second night of the soul is the actual death of the death of the soul, per se, where it's not even your soul moving. The thing that's moving you is not so much your own will as it is the divine will. And you're a servant of the divine will. You're a servant of God. And that's how they talk about it. So all of that, the mysticism is a very deep sea. And I think it's very profound. And it's actually, mysticism is like the flip side of science, in the sense like they're very closely related, because both present a coherent view of reality, right? An absolute harmony permeating all things, and our ability to connect with that and to tap into it.
I'm very grateful that you said it's profound, because so often when I hear the word, it's like people are saying it in a derisive tone. And then I like what you said about how mysticism and science, they're almost flip sides of a coin. I don't think I had ever gotten to see that until listening to the Rising Tide Foundation lectures and being exposed to these scientists, that it's like they fully understood that to really study natural law and the laws of the universe, you are looking into and exploring the mind of God. But it's like most normal people that you run into don't really understand that we really can experience God. We really can have a real relationship with our Creator.
Mm.
And that's what begins to heal all the brokenness and fill up all the emptiness. And it also grows us up little by little by little to where all these shenanigans that the icky people are playing just don't work anymore.
Right.
They may have tried really hard to control every single facet of this game, of our reality, but their tools are worn out and we are growing up. So anyway, thank you very much for answering my question.
Thank you, Susan. Jerry had a question. No, you have been waiting a long time now.
Yeah, I can't remember.
Oh,
what
wait,
my question
Jerry,
was.
before you say, wait a second. I wanted to find out how much time we have left, David.
I'm fine.
Okay.
Mm.
Go ahead, Jerry.
Okay. When you were talking about Soma and Moksha, and it reminded me of the whole MK Ultra experiments, that I think you said earlier, people, have these longings for transcendence. And, sometimes you get a feeling of being unfulfilled. And the bad guys, as you call them, prey on this and use drugs and various, you called it pseudo spiritualism. You blur people's sense of what's imitation or what is real. And I understand all that. But there's this other aspect of it that I've always had in my mind, that I see it used, alcohol as well as medical marijuana is used to combat boredom. You have these people who are bored, and you're just promoting this as so-called the solution to boredom. Now, is there a connection between this, pseudo-spiritualism and just trying to get rid of the boredom? That's my question.
Oh, I mean, hey, I mean, we've all been there, right? I mean, I think the first thing is for a lot of these things is that, we've all been there in one way or another. So, I mean, it's important to acknowledge these things, right? Because a lot of people, I mean, with the mysticism, I mean, or getting, depending on what we're all, mysticism is a vast sea, right? So we can get drawn into it. The boundaries are very blurred. And so we can call it many different things and be led we can call it similar things and be led down very different pathways. So I think that it's an interesting, like the reason I think, as you guys can tell, like this class wasn't fully crystallized. The article is, but then I was like, my mind kept moving. So like I've continued to expand the idea, but there's a lot of nuance, right? Once we get into this stuff, when you're talking about drugs that are now psychedelics that are very much equated with spirituality, and people are excited about spirituality, you also see that's the thing about the bad guys. One of the oldest tricks is the spread of Gnostic cults, paganism, and syncretic religions, right? So what is the earth goddess stuff? What is the Mother Earth stuff, right? Just that calibrating the Adam and Eve, the creation myths, right? The foundational stories for Western civilization, just tweaking them, right? They like to synthesize, right? A Hegelian synthesis. Like, how do we combine it? Let's combine it a bit more this way, a bit less of like guilt, or we'll put the guilt here instead of there. And let's like reduce the emphasis on material, but we'll increase the emphasis on the other thing. And so like, there's somebody who's looking at this thing, like they have like a Venn diagram or something, like there are people. I mean, and that's, I think, what disturbs some people, right? Good people, which is why, I mean, I go back to my polemic of the problem isn't that people really have trouble understanding the bad or the evil. It's that they lack an understanding of the good. And so because they lack an understanding of the good within themselves, they haven't really explored that sea within themselves, right? That sea of unknowing, which is really the deeper knowing, right? Where they just discover that the mystery just gets clearer over time. The mysteries don't go away. The mystery of our soul and our minds and of mankind and the universe, they just become clearer. They never go away. But if people aren't initiated in these things, it's such a huge sea, and it's mysticism, right? You're wandering in mist. So, God help us if we're not pretty confident and mature in our epistemological development, which is what Quan always talks about, right? The epistemological development, such that we can navigate something so sort of nebulous and impenetrable as the mist. So I mean, I think people are bored. So they're looking for something, but they're rightfully bored, right? Like they should be bored. So that's healthy, right? That would be the first thing I say. Good. That means you're healthy. You should be bored, because this is all very fucking boring. But now when we get to the real thing, enter the bad guys, right? So they know. So you see the same thing coming back, just like the Roman Empire, and that's why they were big on cults, right? There's not just one cult, right? There's many cults. Mithra cult for like the ruling classes, and then you have the other cults for the peasants, and you have the other cults, and everybody has their religion. And so, yeah, I mean, it goes on, right? Like the meditation stuff is good, it's important, but you see that they want people to make it into a religion which takes them away from this Renaissance image of man, which is an accurate image of themselves, that they have this divine spark and it can be developed. And so, how do you give somebody something that feels that same, close to that, but makes it manageable?
Thank you, David. I'm getting a crick in my leg because I am looking at you sideways because you're on the side.
Oh, I'm on the side.
Okay.
Thank
you. I haven't forgotten about Nathan, but I'm seeing Yuri has been waiting very, very patiently.
Okay.
I'm going to take Yuri first.
Absolutely.
Okay, and then Nathan, okay?
Yes. I don't even have a comment, really. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Hi.
You don't have anything to comment on, Yuri? Or a question?
How do I get my hand up in the air?
Oh, that works
okay.
too, Rena. Okay, that works too,
You did
Rena. Okay, you did it. You just announced yourself. Okay.
Oh, all right,
So-
may I talk just a moment?
So Yuri is not saying anything. So
Oh, well, yeah, I am.
oh, okay.
Okay. Well, mostly I'm talking in the chat, but I was talking about psychedelic experience, which I haven't done a lot of, but I've done some of it. And I mentioned that the sensation is that it takes you back to your eyes are the eyes of a child. It reminds you of the wonder and the excitement and the beauty of things first observed as a child, and I think that can be useful as a reminder. It wouldn't be something I would recommend you do every day because you won't really be very functional, but I think it can be useful. I think it can be, and then I in the chat I said that I relate that to the act of creation. If you're a painter or a musician and you're creating something, you will find yourself, at least I do, and I know my friends who are creators also, find that they feel that they're being directed outside of their normal reality. It's a different state of mind. It's an altered reality, and I think that's a good thing and a productive thing, and it can be a healthy thing. But having said that, we all know that everything good is hijacked. Everything good is subject to being twisted and wrecked. So I don't advise doing it, but I just want to put that in. I mean especially the act of creation. Creating something and the altered reality that inspires. Oh, that's about it. No real questions, just a comment.
Thank you. Thank you,
Yeah.
Yuri. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, we all come back to reality, right?
Well, I hope so.
We have to live in reality.
Yeah. Don't take too much of it. Take a small dose if you're going to experiment with it. Start slow.
Rena?
Now do I get to talk?
Yes, Rena, go for it.
Because if you don't let me talk, I'll go another 5 years without saying anything.
Go for it.
You all have to understand that I am 97 years old. And so you have to put up with whatever I have to say. I love coming to listen to you all. You all get smarter and smarter. You make my life full. But I have to say on this subject, the fact that this is a mental universe, not a mental material universe, has been discovered for more than 300 years, and you all have missed it. So I would urge you to do the really hard job, which is make sure you're in your mind and not in your pain in your body. And with that, I bid you good night and thank you for letting me talk. I'll be back next week as long as you promise not to throw stones at me. Goodbye.
I was going to make a rebuttal. I don't disagree, but what do you tell somebody who's been stuck in their head most of their life?
Oh, listen, I can't tell you. I got it when I was a very small child. And I got that life is eternal, which means God is all there is. Life is God. And I was so thrilled that, like a child afterwards, I thought, gee, I'll live to be at least 70 years old. I felt as if I'd been dropped out of the sky and hit myself on the chair. And I knew, I got it wrong after getting it good. So the point is, you just keep on trying, getting it good. It's an individual thing. And yours, though it's exactly like ours, is just the one thing for you. Goodbye.
Amen.
Beautiful. And there's a difference between being in your mind and being in your head.
Yeah, and I mean, these things aren't, all these things are, they're not
Metaphysical.
obvious, right? I definitely agree, but that's why it's, what are the things, that's why the Huxley book's interesting, because he talks a lot about practices, you know, and one of the ways they get in there attacking like modern Christian, Judeo-Christian culture is they just look at, you know, there's a lot of ideals and abstraction, right? But then when you look at the average person, a lot of them, you know, for example, Artie Lang talks about the divided self. They're very much angels. It's like angels and demons, right? We're in the image of God, we're all these good things, but we're wicked, right? We're in a fallen world. And so they have their angels and they have their demons, and everything is less so today, but that was the thing that was really tapped into. You know, Huxley's writing this in 1962, Artie Lang, all these things in the 60s and 70s. So they recognized the flaws they critique traditions, right? They weren't necessarily, I think this is how I'd say they do it. They don't necessarily critique the fundamental, deeper epistemological, spiritual questions as such, but they'll say, look at the world, look at these people. You know, they're full of sickness. They're divided selves. They're just constantly at war with themselves. And, you know, there's truth to these things, right? A lot of people don't know how to bridge it's not obvious to always bridge the different parts of ourselves, right? And so the deeper mysticism stuff, the deeper spiritual journey gets to that. And everybody's got wounds, everybody's got things. So again, that's why I think we can appreciate why the bad guys are able to get in there, because people do have, there is a lot of suffering. There are a lot of grievances. There are a lot of injustices. And so, you know, how do you give people something that's an imitation of the real thing, but not the real thing? And whether for economic solutions, political solutions, or spiritual things as well. So it gets pretty, I mean, we could have at this for a long time, right? This is a vast sea. But all the more, that's why, I mean, I think it's important to anchor people to something like, you know, remembering what the Renaissance was about, like what actually allowed Western civilization to transcend, you know, these older oligarchical models, if only momentarily, but even in those brief moments, we're able to unleash a genie, right? That the bad guys are still trying to put back in the bottle 700 years later. You know, let us take a moment to appreciate that, right? And have a sense of the you know, the magnitude. And then we can start to, you know, we want to take ourselves seriously. We should take ourselves seriously in our individual, personal, epistemological, spiritual development, because this is our story too. And new chapters are being written right now, you know, so like the story is unfinished. So we should get our story straight up to now right? Remove whatever illusions we have so that we can, engage in the spiritual warfare strategically, intelligently, and with joy.
I love what Rena said about, everybody's journey. In some ways it's the same, but in other ways it's unique to you. And we really do each need to value our own journey, even the places that were really difficult to get through. We have to value and honor them. And we have to value the journey that others are on as well, and show them that respect. And I also just love what Yuri brought in about the childlikeness, because to be able to return to that place of childlike faith and awe and wonder, I mean, that in itself feels like being reborn.
Thank you, Susan. Okay. Thank you, David, for giving us a wonderful lecture. No, I wouldn't say actually a lecture, thought-provoking presentation. And it also created a lot of discussion here. So I
thank you for letting me unload thoughts. And so we're testing things.
I think we all love hearing your thoughts. Okay. Yeah. So good. So I hope we all will see everybody next week. I do not know what's on the agenda, but I wanted to again say thank you to everybody here that contributed, that was just listening or writing comments. We very much appreciate it. So we'll see you next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.